Oh, hello students, hope you all are doing well. Okay, I'm here again with another session on Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Today we'll be starting the second chapter, Mr. Willy Wonka's Factory. I hope you have done your work, like copy work of the first chapter. So let's go through the explanation and summary of the second chapter. Alright, so this chapter started off with by telling, like the author was telling us about the four grandparents of Charlie, which were Grandpa Joe, Grandma Josephine, Grandpa George, and Grandma Georgina. They were the grandparents of Charlie, and they used to live with him. Okay, so every night after dinner, Charlie used to go into his grandparents' room. Just the sight of Charlie enlivens his grandparents. They were quite old. Every one of these old people was over 90. There was an as shriveled as prunes and as bony as skeletons, and throughout the day until Charlie made his appearance they lay huddled in their one bed, two at either end with nightcaps on, keep their heads warm, dozing the time away with nothing to do. So they are quite old and they're very skinny because Charlie is quite poor and like he doesn't have food to eat. So the only good thing about their life is Charlie. Whenever, all right. So I was telling you about his grandparents. Whenever Charlie used to come home, and they heard Charlie's voice saying good evening, Grandpa Joe and Grandma Josephine, Grandpa George and Grandpa Georgina. Then all four of them would suddenly sit up, and their old wrinkled faces would light up with smiles of pleasure, and the talking would begin. So the whole day they used to just lay down on the bed and just wait for Charlie to come. And whenever he used to be back home and he used to say good evening to his grandparents, they used to get up and they used to become very happy because he was the only good thing for them in their life. So this was their routine. Like they used to have their cabbage soup, they used to have their supper, and then after that, Charlie used to go to his grandparents' room. Grandpa Joe used to tell him stories, different stories, like different interesting stories, which he used to love listening. One night, Charlie decides to ask about Wonka's chocolate factory that opens a can of worms, and Grandpa Joe starts going on and on about the factory and the man behind it. So Grandpa Joe started telling Charlie about Mr. Wonka. Grandpa Joe tells stories to amuse Charlie, and others listen in rapture. One evening, Charlie asks his grandparents about the Wonka chocolate factory, and Grandpa Joe tells Charlie the story of Mr. Wonka. Begins by saying Mr. Wonka is the greatest chocolate maker in the whole world, and his factory is the biggest in the whole world. Okay, so Grandpa Joe was telling Charlie about Mr. Wonka. He begins by saying Mr. Wonka is the greatest chocolate maker in the whole world, and his factory is the biggest in the whole world. Grandpa Joe recounts many of Mr. Wonka's amazing feats, including his more than 200 variety of candy bars. Can you just imagine 200 varieties of candy bars? Which are eaten by kings and presidents across the world. He was so famous that his chocolates were so famous that they used to like go around the world, and all the kings and the presidents used to eat them. Grandpa Joe also regaled Charlie with tales of impossible Wonka inventions, such as ice cream that stays frozen in the sun. Can you just imagine if you put your ice cream? I know it melts, but he invented such an ice cream that stays frozen in the sun, marshmallow that tastes like flowers, and chewing gum that never loses its flavor. So these were a few of the inventions of Mr. Wonka, and they were really amazing. So, students, can you see the picture of Mr. Willy Wonka? Okay, on the right side, there are a few lines from the chapter. Did you know, for example, that he has himself invented more than 200 new kinds of chocolate bars, each with a different center, each far sweeter and creamier and more delicious than anything the other chocolate factories can make? So this is more of praising Mr. Willy Wonka and the type of chocolates he has made. So now Charlie's mom and dad come in to listen to this story, and the grandparents urge Grandpa Joe to tell Charlie about Prince Pondicherry. Prince Pondicherry is related to Mr. Wonka, so you will get to know about this in the next chapter. So in this chapter, what happened in this chapter, Grandpa Joe tells Charlie about the life of Mr. Wonka. He is a magic man because he makes very particular sweets. He's the master of the chocolate factory where Mr. Wonka creates marshmallow that tastes of violet and rich sweets that change color every 10 seconds as you suck them, and little feathery sweets that smell always deliciously in the moment you put them between your lips. This is a magic factory, and Grandpa Joe tells the story to Charlie. Okay, so my personal opinion is that I think that this chapter is really fantastic because it describes the story of the factory and the life of Mr. Wonka, and I like it because it is told by Grandpa Joe, and it's very interesting. Okay, so I am attaching a link of the video in the description below. Please do watch it so that you can have a better idea of the chapter and let me know how did you like it or not.